president-elect of the Association of Jewish Libraries. We are recording this session, so if you don't want your picture showing, then you should turn your video off, but you're welcome to have it on. If you'd like, you can write in the chat box where you're zooming in from. We'd love to hear from you, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, we have a really exciting talk from Chana Pollack, who's the archivist at The Forward, a 125-year-old independent Jewish media organization. Chana has an MFA in film from the San Francisco Art Institute and is a poet and Yiddish translator currently living in the Catskills. I will add that I also love that Chana, as an archivist at a major newspaper, has included things like how to use the Forward archive, which is freely available on the Jewish Historical Press platform, and many, many other publications using the archives. And I, as a librarian, it's wonderful to see the newspaper, an institution that's not specifically a library, taking such incredible advantage of the use of their archives and working with their archivist. So tonight we will be hearing, you don't have to speak Yiddish to know some Yiddish fables, especially your family mices related to Yiddish. We're going to hear from Chana about all of the people and stories that are found in those collections. Chana, take it away.
Okay, so hi, Shalom Aleichem, everybody. I see some old friends and some mentors and people I always look up to in this field of Yiddish archiving. So it's especially exciting to be here. And I also just want to acknowledge that we're in like phase 1 million of the pandemic, and it's kind of a really difficult time for everybody. So it's especially incredibly heartwarming to just see folks show up for this. And just a little course correction, just a teeny bit. It's true, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Forward archive, but the bulk of what I'm going to talk about tonight actually is how we went about uncovering the story of David Duchovny, who most of you probably have heard about if you watched I think, X-Files a million years ago, or if you watched The Chair, about the first woman of color chair of a liberal arts English department. Anyways, he was in that too. Anyways, long story short, some of you may remember a couple of years ago, he published, David Duchovny has started to be continued sort of a career as a novelist, as a writer, and he published in the Atlantic magazine not too long ago a story. I think it was about failing, actually, the joy of failing, or just what happens when you fail and why we shouldn't be so afraid of it. And along the way, he sort of talked about his own background. And of course, he mentioned, like many, many people do, and I hear from a lot of these folks, and maybe some of you out there too, that he mentioned that he comes from a long line of writers, that his grandfather, Moshe Duchovny, was a Yiddish writer who wrote for The Forward. So of course, we got pretty excited about that. And we, somewhat skeptically, because, at this point, we're the last sort of Yiddish secular independent paper standing at 125 years, Mirz Hashem, in April. And so, it's not uncommon for folks to come to us with that idea that their relative or somebody they knew or wrote for us. And it's not often that we can actually find it for very, very many reasons, as some of which I'll elucidate tonight. But anyway, so we had this incredible opportunity to sort of dive in. And of course, I did find out that he didn't write for us, he wrote for the Tog Morgen Journal. So the other major Yiddish paper that was around for a long time. Anyways, long story short, we were kind of like, well, now what do we do? And then a couple of years went by, and we were about to have our gala. We're a nonprofit now, so we were fundraising, and somebody came back with the idea, well, the Chair just came out and Duchovny's in it, and what if, look, let's give it another whirl. Let's see what we can find. So they had me dive back in, and long story short, and I'll get to it in more detail in a couple of minutes, we found his obituary in The Forward, and from there I was able to kind of do a kind of nice uncovering from him. And at the end of, as we progress in the story tonight, I'll happily share with you what transpired when David Duchovny was able to learn about his Yiddish journalist Zeta, Moishe Duchovny. So I'm just going to share my screen and get some slides going. Okay. So this is May. Welcome, everybody. So I don't want to talk to everybody who already knows about the Forward, but just like very, very briefly, in case you don't know about the Forward, we were founded 125 years ago as a progressive socialist Yiddish daily, founded on the Lower East Side. The original building that they built for themselves in 1912 is still there at 175 East Broadway, but currently it's condos for those who can afford them in Manhattan. But it was a 10-story, fully functioning, open 24/7 temple for the Yiddish secular Jew in New York, and basically was a landing pad for so many newly arriving immigrants in the city, so much so that by 1906, like they were founded in 1897, by 1906, before they even had their own building, so many people were coming by the Forward to, ask for support, to get suggestions, to actually pick up their mail, because the Forward always functioned also as a kind of poste restante, as a post office box for newly arrived immigrants. And one of the features in the paper was your briefkasten, like your post office box, and they would actually list people's names and who had mail, along with announcing what ships were arriving in the harbor that day and from where. They also announced, so and so, your mail is waiting for you at the Forward, come and pick it up, your uncle is looking for you, and those kind of things. So much so that by 1906, Ab Khan, the founding editor of the Forward, who you're also probably familiar with that name, he decided that it was time to found an advice column called A Bundle of Letters, because they were sitting on so many peckles of letters that people were sending them and asking for advice. So that's just a little bit. The paper was founded by a group of individuals, by like a collective, of which the remaining founding editor became eventually Ab Khan, but it was a collective to start with. Some of the folks who started were anarchists, most of them were socialists, and their big idea in 1897 was to fight for the working man, to help the Yiddish-speaking individual Jew coming from Eastern Europe, for the most part, to acculturate to American culture, but also to be able to stay connected to what was going on back home. So in a way, we say the Forward was meant to be a mirror both to the Jewish community of, America, and also back to America of the Jewish community. And throughout its early days, and to this day too, it has been cited by the New York Times as the most important American Jewish independent media organization. And back in the day, it was not uncommon, if you were coming through the United States, if you were coming especially to Manhattan, and you were a progressive leader, of a socialist organization, of a Jewish progressive organization, eventually also of a labor Zionist organization, of a union organization, you would make a stop to visit Ab Khan. If you were an actor, Edward G. Robinson, Molly Picon, obviously, Paul Muni, all those folks, would come up and visit the Forward along with the general population. And the building of the Forward, the 10-story building that they eventually built for themselves in 1912 on East Broadway, also housed many related secular Jewish organizations, including the Hebrew Actors Union, including the Farban, the labor Zionist organizations, and including, of course, most of you probably know this too, the Arbeitering, the Workmen's Circle, the fraternal organization that really was invested in, and still is today, in social justice and immigrant and refugee issues, and was sort of a home for many of the Forward readers. So we were always kind of housed together until several years ago, when we sold our building on East 33rd Street. This is like years after we moved away from the Lower East Side to Midtown, and we were still together with the Workmen's Circle. Anyway, so you can imagine this building, which had an auditorium, was just like a hub of, like before there were GCCs, right? This was just a hub of Jewish culture, a hub of literacy, of Yiddish creativity, and also a medical clinic on the ground floor that the Workmen's Circle ran for folks. So in an era where we're talking about public health right now, right, in America, and vaccinations, that lobby in the Forward building, for example, functioned as a place for folks to come and get, for example, their polio vaccine. So that's just a little bit about us. Just an interesting, just how history kind of repeats itself. On the front page of the Forward in 1897, this first issue on the right side is an article about the Cuban Uprising against the Spaniards. The Forward's on the side of the Cubans, Bravo Cubaner, and all the way on the left side is an article that you could imagine being written today, and it's about how in the Yiddish Kvartal, in the Jewish neighborhood on the Lower East Side, the Apteker, the pharmacists, and the doctors, the Doktorim, are having a huge disagreement. The Apteker want to still be able to treat people, and the doctors, right? It was very common in Eastern Europe. If you even go today to parts of Western Europe, Eastern Europe for sure, you can go to the pharmacy and get quite a level of prescriptions before you have to go to see a doctor. It's very common there. It's kind of accepted. The pharmacist almost acts as like a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant. But in America, that was sort of being phased out. So in 1897, they were already starting to have the argument about it, and that's what's going on in the paper. And of course, on top, what they call in newspaper language, those two boxes, those are called the ears. We're also known for this. On the right side, Workers of the World Unite. And on the left side is a less known phrase from Marx, which is that the liberation of the workers is dependent on the workers themselves. So just to give you an idea of who we were, and flash forward, by 2019, we went digital only. So today we're found only online. But back in the day, we were like a full house, meaning that we also printed and published and distributed our own paper all out of that building. The compositors were on the top floor. There was a chute where they sent down the copy when it was copy edited down to the basement where, just vats of ink and huge machinery and all the technology of old school newspaper printing was happening in that basement and out the door, and the trucks were waiting on East Broadway and the newsboys were waiting, and it was like a full service kind of thing. Ab Kahan was actually a revolutionary himself. He was born in Vilna. He had managed to get himself to a seminary, teacher seminary. So he was a pedagogical individual. He was raised in an Orthodox family, but he himself was more interested in socialism. And, the anecdote in his, one of the anecdotes in his memoir was being a young child in, Tsarist Russia and observing several lynchings in his own town of people who had, been accused of distributing anti-Tsarist literature or some such thing. And that really sort of turned him around. And so he got himself an education. He went to a seminary in Lithuania, and then he himself was accused and suspected of what he was doing, which was disseminating anti-Tsarist literature. And so he hightailed it, like many revolutionaries, made his way to Geneva. And from Geneva, he actually hooked up with a group of fellow socialist Yiddishists who were going to come to America. They were part of Amolam, a little known collectivizing group from Eastern Europe. That their idea was to come to America and to go out to the Midwest and to kind of homestead and build sort of American style kibbutzim. But of course, Ab Khan came to New York City, and everything changed from there. like it does for so many people. But just to keep it short, because I want to be able to get to the Duchovny story too, we're just going to skip to the next thing. Most of our archive is the morgue of a newspaper, as you may expect. So is photographs. Most of the photographs that the Forward published, a good deal of them were wire service. They bought from back in the day, International News, Wide World, Acme, from all over the world, Moscow Press Cliche, from Fleet Street. But they were also one of the only newspapers that had their own photojournalists, most notably Menachem Kipnis and Alter Kaczizna, both of whom very unfortunately were murdered in the war, but somehow their work was managed to be saved. And of course, Kaczizna especially had sent material to the Forward the whole time he was working for us. So some of those were saved by us, some of those were saved by Evo. And so this is an example. I'm not sure if this is actually a Kaczizna. There's no credit to this image, but this is typically the type of images in the 20s. Ab Kahan decided, and probably influenced by a lot of the other publications at the time in America, most notably Look magazine, like publishing an illustrated section of your paper was, along with the development of photography, was becoming like a really, sexy, very popular thing to do. So Ab Kahan himself loved art. He loved photography. He always had a cartoonist on staff. And so now they were able to really up their game in terms of photography. So this is typically, you can see it's sepia toned. Every Sunday, they published what was known starting in the 20s, and it ran for about 3 decades. It kind of dropped off by the end of the 40s, like after World War II. And they published an illustrated issue that was called the rotogravure issue, just based on the special type of printing process. It was something that the Forward actually couldn't do in-house. It was something they sent out to do. But it included photography of the community, whether it was bar mitzvah, whether it was my kid is graduating from school, whether it was the Bund convention met, the Arbeiterring met, like a lot of community, sort of before there was do it yourself, before there were blogs. The Forward was kind of understood the concept of including the audience as part of your publishing material. And so, and also a lot showing what was going on in Eastern Europe. So here's an example that people would forward, which is the Shabbos klopper, the individual in town who went around and let you know that, Shabbos was coming with his small hammer on the wooden shutter. So that's like typical of us. But we also published popular culture, especially about the arts. And in the 20s and 30s, most especially classical music was kind of like the rock of the day. And as a lot of the Eastern European immigrants, especially if you didn't come from a small, far-flung shtetl, you would have been open to classical music, and you would have been excited to know where could you hear it in New York. And in fact, many of the early, the Forward was always fundraising. There was always a Forward ball. So many of the Forward events took place with individuals who were, performing pieces of classical music. Like before they were inviting people to do Yiddish music, before they were inviting, even like opera stars to sing Yiddish, they were actually exposing the reading public to classical music. So here's just a typical image from, I believe this is the 40s, I'm not sure, but that's Loren Mazel, a young Loren Mazel who eventually became conductor of the New York Phil. That's him at Interlochen, the arts camp. That's him doing some of his earliest conducting. Sports, a lot of people don't know that the Forward published sports. Of course, boxing was very popular among immigrants, but this is by 1926. This is Andy Cohen, who got drafted by the New York Giants in 26. And this is him. And just a little bit about the format. What I'm showing you now is a halftone print. Part of the Forward's archival holdings are also photographic metal press plates. We printed our own paper in-house. So part of the ephemera that was left over, yes, part of our morgue. So we have the photographic collection, but we also have a great deal of metal plates. And so when I came on about 2 decades ago, a big part of the job of cataloging was also separating in the original file folders and the original file cabinets. You can imagine separating out the actual gelatin silver, the very delicate black and white prints, from the metal plates that are kind of, sometimes glued to them. So as we uncovered our collection, I was always really interested in finding out, as time went on and it became closer and further away from the mechanics of actually printing halftone prints and the paper, I was always interested to see if one day we could maybe show our halftone prints. And so a couple of years ago, you may have heard, along with the Eldridge Street Synagogue, we did a show called Pressed, where together with at the South Street, the Seaport in New York, the Seaport Museum houses one of the oldest printing houses in New York, called Bone Printers. And Rob Wilson, the master printer there, was really excited to join us and collaborate. And so we had several of these photographic plates printed by Rob on just like a typical newspaper, nothing fancy. You can see, they're pitted and they're marked, and they're not like museum gorgeous gelatin silver quality. Newspapers didn't have time or money for that, but this is typically how you would have seen as a forward reader the actual photo in the paper. And we were able to exhibit them at Eldridge Street. And right now we're also partnering with, if you're familiar with, it's a web app, but it's also an app on your phone. It's called Urban Archive, and Urban Archive maps out many different organizations in New York have uploaded images to this geo mapping project in New York. So we uploaded a lot of our photographs to there. You can find and sort of do a walking tour using our photograph to map out the story that's in the photograph on Urban Archive. And now together with Eldridge, you can go online. I think we just, right before I got on, I think we just published online. It's called Pressed. And if you go to Urban Archive, you can actually walk through a lot of the images in the show and see these beautiful restored halftone prints. So that's Andy Cohen. This, of course, is Joseph Greenfield. Some of you may remember. I think he was called the Atom. And he was like, a strong man. He was actually born in Poland, came to America, was a vaudevillian, and supposedly he used his feats of strength to fundraise for the Jewish community a lot. So that's kind of falls under sports for us. We also covered a lot of chess. And in the 50s, we actually covered, we had a column called Yidden happen fish. So it's like Jews go fishing. So, we did cover sports. This is another halftone reprinted showing May Day on Randall's Island, the island, off Manhattan, where a lot of sports still goes on. But just take a look at that crowd. This is like what May Day actually meant to readers of the Forward. And we covered, of course, social justice issues, starting from 1897 with those Bravo Cubaners and the Cuban Uprising. This is up in the Bronx. I think it's Allerton Street, and this was a rent strike. And we weren't completely Ashkenaz-centric, although it's hard to imagine because we were a Yiddish paper. But we had a reporter, Moshe Bluznovsky, who traveled almost exclusively out in Jewish communities in the Middle East and especially North Africa. This is Algeria, and this is a sukkah. And so he reported back for us and also took his own photos. The Forward Taught folks had a vote. This is a late stage, please vote along the Labor Party line. So at this point, they've no longer trying to get America to accept a socialist party, and they've moved on to the Labor Party. And this is a Roosevelt-Lehman election, and they're asking forward readers to vote along Labor Party lines. And by the next election, of course, it was full on for the Democratic Party. So that's sort of the evolution. The Forward taught folks about the arts. What you're looking at here is, if people know Betty Boop, so the Fleischer Studios, we did a full article about how animation works for our readers. And this here is Bimbo, the character Bimbo. Most importantly, if you look underneath, you see 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the Forwards teaching readers very early on in the 30s about how animation actually works. And they did a whole full page. So this reprint of Bimbo is actually reprinted from one of those metal plates. So it was really interesting what we found. On the one hand, pure newspaper photography, the sports guys, the Randall's Island, the rent strike, and then boom, some of their arts coverage. So, okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit also about the responsibilities of an archivist at the Forwards. So some of what happens more and more as we progress into the digital era is, like, for most people, content is like king now, right? Like, you're really kind of asked to do a lot of diving for content. So I work with editorial pretty closely. And so this is a story that Adam Langer, who is our executive editor, he did a story. This is from 2018, when ICE was kind of prominent in the news, and this is the story of an individual who needed to seek refuge because they did not wish to be deported, and so they sought refuge in a church in Washington Heights, and a very prominent synagogue in Washington Heights. I think it's called Hebrew Tabernacle. Their rabbi was also very deeply involved in this. So at the time, I had just been asked, does the Pesach's coming up, what do you have, archivally, some kind of story that might be good for the paper, for Pesach? What do you think we could? And so I did a dive, and I found out that in 1943, there was a public Seder in Washington Heights for the young kinder transport refugees that had recently arrived in New York City. And these were kids, obviously kinder transport. Most of them did not have parents and did not, know necessarily what was going to be the story with their parents. Some of them did, some of them didn't, the bulk of them didn't. Anyways, Simon Weber, who eventually became the Forwards editor at the time, he was the writer assigned to the story, and they did a full 2-page story on this incredible Seder that was taking place, and that was clearly referencing the story of an exodus from slavery and an exodus from near death. So Adam Langer got wind of that story, and it had the names of the individuals who were interviewed by Weber. It had their picture and their name, and he looked at it and he realized that one of those young boys was actually Max Frankel, who some of you may recognize that name. He was the executive editor of the New York Times for a long time, and so he realized that there might be a story here, and so he started to look for those individuals. So he ended up creating an award-winning story using archival material from 1943, the story of young kinder transport folks having one of their first Seders in freedom and their experience, while at the same time he went and he interviewed this individual who was seeking refuge in 2018. So that's sort of just another aspect of what some of my responsibilities are. And on the lighter side of things, some of you may not know that we published, the one English language book, the Forward also had an imprint and was busy kind of publishing books, but the one English language book we did publish was American Jewish Cooking. It was by our food editor, Regina Frischwasser, based on a contest she had run in the Forward for like decades, 20s and 30s, and finally in 48, with the war over, etc., she dedicated this book of recipes sent in by Yiddish readers and speakers to the next generation that was, coming forth, that would not necessarily have this connection to Eastern Europe, given everything that had just occurred in our history. So long story short, Liza Schoenfein, one of our food editors, I found an article about why don't Jews eat pie? And it was actually published, this is the other thing, some folks don't know that in the 20s, the Forward actually published an English supplement. They were experimenting with the new generation of English readers. And so it was actually an article that I found in English in the paper. And so she too did a collaboration between the archival material and the, pie. It was, the popularity of pie today. Okay, so I see that I'm at 7:30, so I'm just gonna jam here and just go really fast. So Long story short, we understand that, we want to find out about Moshe Duchovny and his Yiddish writing, but I know that he wasn't one of my writers. And I know this because the forward has its own lexicon of Yiddish writers. Not that everybody's in there who wrote for the forward. It's kind of complicated, but he's not in there. And but I know his, sorry. And also I should say, if you're researching a Yiddish writer, the first thing you're going to do is go to the Yiddish lexicon. You have to know Yiddish to use it, but somebody online has begun to translate it. So it is available online. Long story short, a lot of writers, there's a little bit of a controversy because it was published, this lexicon was published post World War II with German reparation funds, and a lot of writers, for example, Bashevis, did not want to be included in it. So I'm going to assume Moshe Duchovny was not in there. I'm going to assume he also excluded himself from that. Or maybe they just didn't look for him. I don't know, but he wasn't in there. So there's almost no trace of this individual, and the Duchovny family themselves doesn't seem to know. So I go back to the forward. This is the entry page for our paper on the Jewish Historical Press Project that's run out of the National Library of Israel. Our back issues are, rights free for the most part, and they're available to research here. And the other thing that's really, really helpful, if you're looking for a Yiddish writer that you can't find anything about, the first thing I usually do is see if we wrote an obituary for him. So my mazel, let's say, was that Moshe Duchovny was such a beloved journalist, I found out through this obituary, that he was also front page of the forward was his obituary. Moshe Duchovny bewusster Schreiber tot zum 58 Jahr. The funerals today, 11:30. Moshe Duchovny, acclaimed writer, dead at 58. It was a shock to the community. So the beauty of a Yiddish obituary of a writer or of a person in the community, I'm making a huge generalization, but my experience is that they tend to be really intimate and really warm. Not to knock off the New York Times obituaries are the gold standard, but the Jewish press, the Yiddish press especially, can give you details that you will not find anywhere else. For example, it's also really, really helpful to know in Yiddish land what somebody's political affiliations might have been. Why? Because that can also sort of lead you to where they might have published. If you don't have a bibliography, right? I didn't have any trail. So using this, I was able to understand where he was buried. And he was buried in a section of the cemetery in New Jersey that was the Labor Verband. So then I understood a little bit more about where this individual might have affiliated and might have published. And so it did make sense that he wrote for the Tog Morgen Journal, which was generally understood to be more Zionist and more Orthodox affiliated than the forward was. So interestingly, though, like I found his obituary, I also was able to find a little bit more about the family. So it turns out this is David Duchovny's Bubby, and she ran a travel agency on West 40th Street. And not only did she run a travel agency, but she ran a travel agency that in this iteration here in the early 50s was offering some of what I believe are the first tours to the state of Israel. So, it just sort of proved a little bit more their connections to, Zionism and labor Zionism. Another very, very handy search engine that a lot of us use is on Facebook. It was created by the amazing Amanda Miriam Chaya Siegel, who's the Yiddish librarian, and so much more at the Dorot in New York Public Library. So this is where I go. It's called Yidforsh, and the amazing thing for me, and there's an article actually in this month's issue of the Packenträger from the Yiddish Book Center where Ruchel Kafferson interviewed a bunch of us, including me, about what it's like to use Yidforsh and what are some of the issues. And for me, it's a tremendous bridge because everybody from around the world who is trying to find out this information is there. So just to speed it up, you never know what's going to happen to you when you go to the Dorot, and they were really helpful in my research, and then asked me if I wanted to talk about what I was doing there. So that was kind of fun. Okay. Another thing that I think a lot of people know, but you can't imagine how helpful this is. This is the character recognition search engine. I think 11,000 Yiddish books have been loaded into this. It's free. It's at the Yiddish Book Center site. So on a whim, I was kind of desperate. I entered Moshe Duchovny, and it was like a gold mine. Aside from the information, like what I had at this point was I had his obituary, right? So I knew a little bit about the individual. Actually, I knew a lot. I knew that he was from Berdichev originally, that the family hailed, they believed they hailed from the Rebbe, the Berdichev Rebbe. So it all starts to really kind of come together very beautifully for like an artsy writing family. And then I started to find really interesting citations in there, because what you will get returned to you is anywhere that this individual has been mentioned. So here's a wild one. This is the writer Henry Shoshkes wrote a book in '54, Through Unknown Lands, or, you know, it's like a travel journal, I'm assuming. I don't know. I didn't read the book, but the citation blew me away. Shoshkes is about to travel, and he says in Yiddish, I had some luck. Before I left America, I went to my editorial colleagues and I told them that I'm likely going to go and travel to Egypt, right? So our editorial colleague, Moshe Duchovny, calls me over and says, well, as you're in Alexandria, if you're going to go to Alexandria, you've got to visit my sister. She is the wife of a famous pianist there, and she will receive you really well. So, you know, it just gave me a little bit more color, and it also sort of gave me some of the individual sort of what his voice actually sounded like and what he might have been like as an individual in the office. And just to throw out another one, somebody else in one of these citations, famous Yiddish writer Gershon Einbender, he published under the pseudonym Copper Paver. He was mostly a children's writer. And he cited that Duchovny was known to be a chassid of Proust. So he was a lover of Proust. So that gave me like another sort of gem. So I highly recommend, and just to push forward, I'd like to share with you the end result of it's not the end. What I found out was that he actually he wrote novels too. So my dream as the archivist is to be able to go back in there and to find his novels and to bring them out. But not my job right now, but here you're gonna see, this is our editor-in-chief, Jody Radurin, who, and David Duchovny, who is so excited that we actually found stuff, that he agreed to host our gala. And here she'll explain more of what we found, and watch what happens when he finds out. Oops, sorry, gotta go back. Okay, there we go.
David Duchovny, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This whole thing started with the piece you wrote in The Atlantic in February, where you mentioned that your grandfather, Moshe, was a journalist at Yiddish language newspapers, including The Forward and The Morning Journal. And you said that none of his writing survives. He died when he was 60, the age you are now, and you were just a baby. And you said in the piece, I can only guess at him. Well, our amazing archivist, Chana Pollack, has found some material to help with your guesses. As you might know, but our audience doesn't, Moshe came from Ukraine in 1918, and your family traces its roots back to a famous rabbi, Levi Yitzchak Berdichever. Moshe wrote plays and reviews, mostly for the Yiddish language Der Tog, and he also managed the children's journal of the Workman's Circle, which was very close to the Forward. He was much beloved. Hundreds came to his funeral. The IL Peretz Writers Union was said to be cloaked in grief when he died. And we found things, quotes, I mean, until his final day alive, Duchovny radiated new projects, interviews with famous Jewish personalities, new book reviews and articles about general Jewish communal lives that were very well received by Jewish readers. He always had a friendly smile for everyone, the Forward's obit said, and people loved spending time in his company. So I want to show you some of what we found, some clippings from the Forward, from other Yiddish papers and other sources. Chana really went on a big deep dive here. I don't think you've seen this stuff, so I'm excited to share it with you.
I'm crying already. I mean, I don't know anything about him really. What you just said is more than I know, and it's really nice to hear.
The first thing I'm going to show you is the obituaries that ran on the front page of our paper, the Forward, and also Der Tog, and there was a pretty extensive obit in English in the New York Times. So let's take a look at those.
I mean, that's November 2nd, 1960, so I'm not even 3 months old yet. Yeah, I don't think I was.
Yeah, so those on the left of the screen, we've got the forwards obit. And as I said, it was on the front page. Right underneath is the Der Tog, which was a very extensive, long obit. And then on the right, you have what was in the New York Times. And there's actually, you can see there's a discrepancy about whether he was 58 or 59. I had said 60 because you said 60, but it looks like he was a little younger.
Wow. Yeah, my dad had said he was 60. I mean, that's just all I was going off of. I don't
I mean,
know
I
his
wouldn't be
exact-
surprised if he didn't know, born in, who know, people don't know exactly what year they're born, right? From the old country.
Yeah.
So we covered the funeral in the forward also, and it seems like everyone who was anyone in the Yiddish writers world was there.
2nd Avenue and 10th Street. I wasn't living there yet, but my family moved to 11th Street and 2nd Avenue when I was about 10 years old. So the funeral chapel's right there where I grew up.
Amazing. And he's buried in New Jersey. Did you know he was buried in New Jersey?
I didn't know that.
So after we found the obituaries, we looked back to the obituaries gave us a lot of clues as to his life. So we went back to see what else we could find. We found a number of other mentions in the foreword of both Moshe and his wife. There were sort of advertisements for events he was involved in. He was known apparently as Dutchy, was one of his nicknames, and he was hosting a campfire. He wrote what was described as a grotesque play called Hitler's Downfall, and that was also performed by the children.
Grotesque would probably mean farcical, I think.
Yes, I'm sure you're right. Yeah. And that's the clip on the right. And then he was chairing this other literary musical evening with a lot of great noted poets. And then on the bottom, we found some stuff about your grandmother, Julia. She ran this travel agency.
Yes, she did. Her name wasn't even Julia, though. It was Hannah, but she changed it to Julia. She thought it was more American.
I'm sure she's right. So she ran an ad, and then we also wrote an article about that she had gone about her flight to Israel, about her trip to Israel. I know you said that none of his writing survives. Well, this big thing on the left here is one of his reviews. And that was one of his most frequent thing. He wrote reviews in Der Tog. We also believe that he serialized novels in one of these publications, and Chana is still looking for those. So we will certainly tell you if we found them. And then on the right, there's a picture where he looks quite a bit like you, I think, from a 1948 edition of something called The Jewish Farmer. And then the last slide is a program of one of the plays he wrote called Onward and Struggle.
And was it what language was the play written in? Was it written in Yiddish? I mean, I was always
in Yiddish,
yeah.
Let's just talk about what we just saw. What does it feel like to see this stuff that you hadn't seen before?
It's overwhelming, really. It's I just to think of his vitality and his commitment and his obviously his playfulness too, and his creativity. He's very, very busy. He's in many places, and obviously he was loved, and it's a lot to take in. Sorry, it's a lot to take in.
Oh, it's okay. I was really touched by what you wrote in your Atlantic article. You said, "This is why I must write. It's my way of communicating with my ancestors, talking to the dead, Ami, your father, and Moshe, of reaping what was so lovingly."
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. And just the end of the story for now is Duchovny's tweet back to us to thank us for doing that. So that's just a little bit of what we do at the Forward. And I just want to thank you so much. I went way over my time. And that's
you.
That's it.
Thank you, Chana. This has been really just wonderful, a wonderful deep dive into just how to find stuff. And especially, just take one name and you find so many different things. I can tell you that Der Tag and Morgen Journal is on the docket for digitization. for the J Press
Really?
project. So you might have to wait a few years, but hopefully it'll make your research a little easier for finding that serial novel. I would like to open the floor for questions. Anybody who has questions can either unmute themselves or add it to the chat, and I'm happy to share it. If you don't want to identify yourself, you're welcome to chat me directly, and I'm happy to put that forward. I'll start. And my question is, what is sort of your, as the archivist for the forward, so what is your what does your a day in the life look like? Are you still doing processing work? Is is it mostly research, assistance to the writers? What does it look like for you?
Yeah, really good question. Kind of like what I said, I saw my sort of responsibilities really shift as we became digital, and also as our back issues became digitized and more accessible. And also, I should say, the editor-in-chief is super excited to be sort of at a legacy publication that has an archive, right? Because a lot of newspapers can't keep their archives, or don't, when they go digital, a lot of organizations can't keep their archives, so, or their archivists. So she's kind of excited about it. And so they started a feature called Ask the Archivist. I think a lot of organizations are doing this now, kind of making us a little more public facing. So a lot of my time right now is kind of digging through queries, because once we, the David Duchovny story we published, kind of like what I showed the other story, that we sort of published it as an archival piece, and invited readers to send in queries. And that's like really, I have people, I'm sure a lot of you know this about the Forward, but the Forward published for decades lists of survivors. Right. And so a very common story is my family was able to come to America because our relatives in New York read, or, in America read the Forward and saw that we had survived, saw our name, and were able to start the process, because they, that's how they found out. So I do frequently get those questions of, can you find the list where my parents' names showed up? So, or a photo. A gentleman just sent in a photo the other day as part of Ask the Archivist, and it's a beautiful family, like huge family shot. It looks to me like it was taken on the rooftop of the Forward building, because I know that it was very common if there was a group shot, they would go up to the roof to take it, and you can see the bridges behind. So I kind of have an idea that that would make the most sense. It's taken a very early, probably 1910, 1915, maybe 1920. And it was published, they said, the anecdote in the family handed down is it was published in a Yiddish paper because it was the largest grouping of an Ashkenazi family grouping that was known to exist at that time in America, because 3 sisters of one family married 3 brothers of another family. So that's the family anecdote that ends up on my desk with the photo. And then like the pitch is like, can you find it in the paper? So, yeah. And then there's editorial. So for example, just last week, we published an op-ed about the situation with the Uyghurs in China and the genocide that's going on there. And so that writer specifically went out of their way to ask me to look up materials that they could, what did the Forward write about in, on the heels of World War II that would be comparable, and so I was able to, obviously that stuff has already been generated. And so I was able to offer it to them so that they could compose an article that sort of looked to our legacy and what we've done, and also speak to the community in a very specific kind of Forward Jewish way. So that's that's a lot of time. So that is a lot of my time. And
no, I mean, yeah.
But at the same time,
sounds fun.
The press exhibit just went online, just went up today. So there's some of that. It's kind of a mix. And actually we're having the we got an NEH grant last year for an assessment. So I'm actually, so that's kind of nuts and bolty archiving kind of, and then there's the research end of it. It's kind of like a mix. It's really a mix.
Sounds great. Zachary Baker had a question for you.
Yeah, thank you. So the question I have is, how does the morgue and other archival materials that you have tie in or not to, for example, the YIVO's Forward Association and Obcon papers and other forward-related collections?
Yeah.
Collections. Yeah.
Easy answer, they do, and I frequently have to use them. For example, just the other week, we published our first Los Angeles newsletter, and the editor who was writing it thought it would be really cool. We all know we had a Los Angeles branch, and nobody really knows where it was. Like, what was the address on that? So in order to get that, I had to like kind of hustle up some business records, and they're at Evo. I was able to see that the Los Angeles materials are at Evo. So intellectually, there's a ton of crossover. And also, I should just say that the secret legend of the Forward Archive, Bichlal, is that there was a tremendous archivist. You probably got to meet him, Kempinski.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I was always told that the Forward, when it was moving buildings in the 70s, was, in dire financial straits and was just jettisoning. And other editors, for example, Alana Newhouse, she famously said, look, a newspaper's institutional memory is like the length of an article or the worth of a day. And that's why, today's news, tomorrow's fish wrap is really true. So when the Forward was finished with their, photos that they were using for the day, it was like shoved into a folder and put it, lucky for us, they did actually have a photo library, and I've met the last photo librarian. So that's kind of great. But when the time came that they were, really financially strapped, supposedly they were just jettisoning things. And I've heard this from another gentleman approached me with stuff, and somebody at the Carry in Rochester just called me and said, hey, somebody just gave, accession to us Yiddish type that they, font that they say they bought from the Forward in the 70s. So the legend of the photo archive is, or the morgue, is that Kempinski heard that they were jettisoning stuff, and he got ripping mad, and he came downtown, grabbed what he could, and took it over to Evo. So
He's a volatile personality.
Really?
Temperamental, yeah.
Wow. Oh, I gotta call you. I want to know more about him, because he's always like sort of stood as this towering figure that respected the value of the history that the Forward had created and didn't want it to just be thrown out. So
talk to Jack Jacobs. He knew him really well.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
I had a question about sort of the modern history of the Forward, and that is, now that the Forward has moved completely to digital, something that I think a lot of us who are librarians who work with rare special collections and also digital materials think about digital preservation and how and whether the digital is preserved. And is that something that comes into your purview, or something that, we have trusted repositories, we have, institutional digital archives, things like that. Is that something that
you're talking about the site itself, the site as we're making it now, right? From 2019?
Yeah.
It's a great question. It's not really in my purview, but I expect that it's housed on our network. I don't think there's any extraneous, but I think it's sort of through the process, the daily process, it's kind of housed there. Yeah, like there is an IT team on staff, and I think it's entrusted to them.
Okay. I mean, this is something that practically comes up for me as a librarian who does reference for people doing research. So it's if it's an article that appeared,
okay,
once the articles went digital, is that still accessible?
Yes.
And that's an ongoing issue that I think many of us are trying to grapple with.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There is I think 10 years worth on our site that you can search.
There's another paper that will remain nameless that is important for Jewish studies, that it's as if they didn't write, the last 20 years, because they just moving on. The fish wrap.
Right? It's
example.
really true. It's really, really true. It's just,
Yeah, but
it's-
newspapers are so critical for history,
well,
as
yeah,
you've shown. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that they're considered, the famous line is the first draft of history. A newspaper
Yeah.
article is the first draft.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm very grateful to the National Library of Israel's project. It's incredible.
yeah. And I think the forward specifically was partially due to Evelyn Ehrlich at NYU getting that online. I think she was involved with that. Formerly of NYU, she's now retired. So just a shout out to her. So any other questions?
I have a JPress question relating to the forward, because sometimes people have asked me, well, one person, for example, Henry Sapoznik has asked me, I can't find the New York
1942.
edition. What?
Oh, 1942. Oh, New York edition.
I can't find the New York edition for the date range I'm looking at. I see whether it's Philadelphia or Boston or whatever, Newark, but where's the New York? So how did they put that all together, what they did?
I don't think they have a choice. I think it's really scattered, and I have had to do that kind of search where it was very specific. I needed like a city edition of a very specific edition. And I'll tell you, my route is like, Dorot, the Tamiment. A lot of people don't realize the Tamiment.
At NYU?
Yeah, and they're open to the public, and they have a full run. And then YIVO,
because it's a labor archives. I mean,
and they hold the Jewish Labor Committee's papers, which is very connected to the forward, and they hold Vladik's papers, which he was like our first business manager. So there's a lot there. So that's kind of my loop. And then, I talked to Eyal Miller, the project manager at the, like you just have to pick everybody's brain. It's crazy. It's very kind of dinosaur archaic, but yeah. And also, we used to have the associate editor of the Yiddish, most of you probably know, it's a Gottesman of the folklorist. He really loved to like troll eBay and buy up, the old Chrishling bound, and it's not pleasant to have to house those, but this is what happens. It's like somebody will look for a very, like Henry Sapoznik will need 1942 from November, and it's not, nobody has, so you have to kind of jump around and ask everybody, and it's like the meta universe of the forward. Like nobody really realizes it unless you're like a Henry, you're looking for something very specific, and then you realize that all the ads you're going by are, oh, they're from Baltimore. Oh, this isn't the New York forward. This is the so yeah.
Wow. I want to also shout out, I recently, actually a former Columbia alum mentioned that there's actually, for those of you, there's a Twitter bot that tweets out old forward articles.
No.
I'm looking for it now because I follow it, and it used to be here it is. It's at @random_forverts. I'm gonna put the link in the chat. And I have found it to be fabulous. I mean, just from all over time. I just put the link in.
Where is that coming from?
So it's from the Jewish Historical Press. They basically set it up to pull a random article from JPress.
Oh, that's so cool. So not just the forwards. It's all the papers.
It's just the forwards.
Oh, it's just
so they set it up to pull just forwards articles. So so on any given day, it's like 1906 and then 1975.
Wow.
And it's completely arbitrary. So it's you never know what's going to show up. Jackie had a question. Go ahead.
So I didn't realize, because only my great grandmother read the forwards originally when I was a child. The editions would have been different in different cities. Would the columns, like the knitting and crocheting columns, have been different? Were those local?
Yeah, it's such a good question. For the most part, it's really, really hard to say, and it really, really is dependent on the news of the day. Like basically what happens in newspapers, like that's why they're so, in a way, insensitive about their own history, like what they are creating in the moment, because the news is everything. So that could
Right.
push anything anywhere. You never know. So
I'm looking for a pattern that I know my bubby used because there's a mistake in it. And then somebody else had the same mistake. Therefore, the pattern had to have the mistake, not my bubby. Two different people couldn't have made the same mistake.
Wow. And this is, I'm sorry, did you say the forward or this?
Well, I believe that's what Bubby read. I do remember
Oh, the
seeing
forward.
The
So,
forward,
because we sold the forward had a real, this is like a whole other presentation, is like all the different things they sold to create an income stream, right? So they sold patterns for a while.
Oh, so maybe
that's where it came from. So it's not actually in the new. Okay, I've got to share the screen. Hang on. So, hang on. Let me get to. I don't want to share something. So it's a very common pattern that you would do it challah in Hebrew or Yiddish. But Bubby, who did not read English at all, not a letter, made this for my mother.
Oh, that's so
but
cool.
it's BB.
I see the R.
No, it's BR. The R is
Yeah.
upside down.
Upside down.
Oh, it's upside down.
You see, look, it's
Wow.
open here.
You know, we sold dress patterns. I don't know if we sold. So you're saying, I bet we did
And
this.
Bubby
too.
made dresses too. But you can see how it's not smooth at the edges. It's because I finished this piece because
Beautiful.
somebody told Bubby the R is upside down, and she
Wow.
said something, I don't know what she said, and shoved it under her bed, and I found it after she passed. She redid it. She figured out how to make the R come right side up. That's without reading English.
Wow, gorgeous.
And because when my mother took it to be framed, somebody else had the same piece.
Really? Were
So
they a forward reader?
I assume, and the women knew each other.
Well, that's where I would go. I
The
would
woman
try
she
to
borrowed
find.
her wedding dress from, and that was what Bubby made my mother for her wedding gift.
That's so cool. Wow.
But
you
they
should-
sold patterns, so that's a whole nother.
Yeah.
That's a
So I mean,
totally-
you know,
Wow.
send me an email. Ask the archivist. We'll try to crack this.
Yeah. Anyway.
And then maybe post the correct pattern.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was in Bubby's head. I think all you have to, if you do fillet crochet, you just have to add a row to make it.
Wow.
Oh. Okay.
Wow.
All right. I see we're at time, but I want to thank you, Chana Pollack, for this just really wonderful
Thank you.
talk.
Oh,
this has been
cool.
really fun, really interesting. And, you know, I think it encourages lots of us to think about our potential Yiddish connections and where we might have found something in the forward or elsewhere.
Cool.
So thanks again. Thank you, everybody, for
you.
joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me, Amalia.
Jackie, you're on the, I can't.
Thanks for moderating, Michelle. Wonderful work as well.
Okay, we're done, and I'm ending.
Yeah, you can.